Why don't we have a chance to sit down here and we can move this along? I always feel that if I'm standing between the audience and lunch, it's a dangerous thing to do, so I'm not going to do it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ron Marks. I am a visiting professor here at George Mason in the Schar School. I see a couple of my students out here. What's the matter? You didn't get enough the first time around? I'll punish you even more now. Although as a moderator, the real trick is to get in and get out real fast and let the experts do the talking. All that being said, while I still have the floor, one of the classes that I teach here is in fact on the subject of national security policy and technology, emerging technologies. As you know, I drag you poor guys from cyber through the environment, through all kinds of military activities, through space and wherever other domains we have, and certainly cyber. Let me just frame this thing with just a couple remarks. As many of you know who are my students, one of my favorite management movies is The Godfather. There are a number of lessons to be taken from that, but one is contained in an Italian phrase, which is tempi cambi, times change. In my lifetime, and it's getting longer all the time, I have watched a number of things happen which in fact so impact us now in ways that even I must admit I'm surprised. When I was born in, and I'll say the number so don't be shocked, 1956, the world's population was barely over 3 billion. It is now 8 billion. And by the way, 5 billion of those people are hooked on something, and this is all Mr. Jaffer's fault, in social media and on the internet, in cyberspace, which was a domain created in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We additionally now have, in this world, a level of poverty that is at as low as we have ever seen, probably something on the order of 3 to 5% of the population of the world. It was 50% when I was first around. We have probably about 50 countries when I was born. We have over 200 of them now. And there are any number of them, as our previous speakers have said, are failed nation states. Maybe an old-fashioned term, but it still works. Or powerful non-nation states. How in the world 50 years ago would I explain the phenomenon of an ISIS that in fact took advantage of a new domain to project its power? So when we start talking a little bit about states cooperating in the common space, in the common ground, we have a very different and much more complicated situation than we ever had to deal with before. I might also add that we have a lovely 20th century institution in the United States government, built at the end of World War II for the most part, a tribute to staff and line charts that were developed by the Prussians and Napoleon, and I might add Roman legions, dealing with now transnational issues of all kind, and of course, a revitalized domain in space and a new domain in cyber. That is why we're going to address this today. This is in fact probably one of the most important issues of our age, how states cooperate, compete, and coerce in a place that nominally belongs to all of us. As I've just implied, the world has grown a lot smaller and a lot more crowded and continues to do so. So we're going to talk about the ocean, we're going to talk about cyber, we're going to talk about space, we're going to talk about climate today, and basically how you can set rules in places such as cyberspace. Jaffer will explain to you exactly how orderly cyberspace is.
Awesome.
No problems in that direction.
All going great.
All doing great. No problems whatsoever. I pick on him only because that is unfortunately my area of expertise for the last 25 years. I served at CIA, I served on Capitol Hill in the last 25 years. I've either owned software firms or have been ruling the roost and found very quickly what a disorderly world that is. So, and as good moderator that I am, my time is now to be quiet and to step away and turn it over to the experts. We have a number of great experts here today. Sally Ezell, Senior Fellow and Director, Environmental Security Program at Stimson. Our focus is on ocean security, climate security, and wildlife protection. That's a heck of a portfolio there, partner. And she worked for John Kerry on Capitol Hill. We have some cross friendships there. Jamal Jaffer is one of the reasons that George Mason has gone up in ranking. The founder and executive, and of course Ellen Leibson as well, gone up in as founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at our law school here. I would advise you to have a chance to look at the website, to attend some of those meetings. Excellent material. Assistant Professor of Law and Director of National Security Law and Policy Program at our law school here. And finally, Stephanie Epner, Senior Director for Global Initiatives at the Climate Imperative Foundation. I wanted to get that right. Recently served in the Biden NSC, National Security Council Senior Director for Climate and Energy. So in rank order, why don't we take Sally first, and please feel free to take the platform.
Great, thank you so much, Ron, for that nice introduction, and thank you, Ellen, for inviting me, and I'm really thrilled to be here at this all-day symposium, really focusing on the global commons and security issues. So my role today, I'm going to really focus on the ocean. And really, I'm going to start out here wide, and then I'm going to bring it down to some very specific issues that are happening on the coast of West Africa. So let's consider the ocean. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Let's consider the ocean for a minute, if we could. Looking at this picture, the ocean makes up 70% of the Earth's surface. And it regulates climate. It supports critical ecosystems. It serves as a conduit for transportation and trade. And it's a source for minerals that we find in batteries, electric vehicles, cell phones, pharmaceuticals. It delivers energy. Sources of wind, oil and gas, geothermal, and it provides food for the globe, particularly through its global fisheries. And all of these different activities, obviously, they support jobs and livelihoods for billions and billions of people worldwide. In fact, the ocean contributes, at last accounting, $2.5 trillion annually to the global economy. So, without saying, the ocean is a large space with a lot of competing demands, and that's why we have this classic example of the global commons and the tragedy of the commons, which we were talking about a few minutes ago. In fisheries, there's often too few fish, too many fishermen chasing too few fish, and what's the competition globally about that? And we'll talk more about that. So it's really, the ocean is under assault. We read all the time about plastic and toxic pollution, overfishing, and just the dramatic effects that I'm sure Stephanie will talk about of climate change and how it affects species and habitats and how it's affecting the overall ocean systems that regulate our planet. So when we go beyond 200 miles, that's the exclusive economic zones of most countries, we end up trying to figure out how do we manage these different interests and demands, and it becomes exceedingly more difficult politically, operationally, and logistically. There are layers of frameworks, as we heard from Kathleen. There's laws and regulations that exist to govern this area known as the high seas. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the London Convention on Marine Pollution, regional fishery management organizations, and the recent High Seas Treaty known as BBNJ. So how do we deal with all of that? But on the high seas, what we find way too often is it's sort of this mentality of out of sight, out of mind, where nations' activities by their fishing vessels or their ocean industries, they just look the other way or they don't pay attention. And what this does is it really undermines the network of this consensus-based rules that we created to protect the ocean, and it puts the whole global commons at risk of really collapsing. And as I said, nowhere is this more obvious than in global fisheries. So fisheries provides the livelihood and food for coastal communities all around the world, particularly in the global south. Just to give you an example, in Senegal, 70% of the protein intake comes from fish. And in Sierra Leone, that is 80%. In earlier research we did a couple of years ago, we tried to figure out, okay, who has the largest distant water fleets? Where are they going? What are their motivations? And not a big surprise to everyone today is it's China. China is number one. And what were their motivations, or what are their motivations to really expand their fleet significantly? Well, first of all, it's food security. They want to get as much food as they can home. They have the largest they're the largest seafood producer, and they're also the largest seafood consumer. Second for China is economic security. You know, their fishing fleet has expanded their economic reach all around the world as part of their Marine Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative is not just infrastructure. Terrestrially, there's a big marine component as well. And then the third is military security. The PRC has really exerted disputed territorial control over nations' prime fishing grounds in, for example, the South China Sea, where Chinese vessels are often accompanied by their Coast Guard as they move around the area. And we just heard today that the Philippines, which has the richest fishing grounds that are in contested waters, is putting forward another claim of their sovereign right. So the rapid expansion of Chinese-owned and flagged distant water vessels has been particularly acute in West Africa, and that's where I'm going to kind of drill in. And that's where their vessels are often taking advantage of poor enforcement and are really responsible for significant overfishing and illegal fishing practices. And accompanying this increase of vessels is the growth of Chinese fishing enterprises. New ports, new seafood processing facilities, and new fishing bases. And these investments, as I just said, really serve this sort of multi-purpose approach. In addition to bringing the fish back home, these investments are really projecting China's economic and diplomatic presence in the Gulf of Guinea. So how do they get there, and how does it work? So the PRC negotiates fish access agreements to other countries' waters on a bilateral level. And when you think about Africa, think of all, in the Gulf of Guinea, all those small countries down the west coast. And so they go one after another, and essentially these countries then all compete with each other to get the best deal from China. Yet the resources are not individual countries. They're transnational. They migrate up and down. What happens in one country clearly affects another. And why do we care? We care because the Gulf of Guinea is the richest fishing resource in the world. In 2019, 5.6 million metric tons of fish were caught. So what does that even look like? Well, think about 5.6 million cows. That is what is being caught up and down the west coast in the Gulf of Guinea. So last week we published this new report. I'll also put it out there. It's called Charting a Blue Future for Cooperation Between West Africa and China on Sustainable Fisheries. It's on the Stimson website. But we really highlighted some of the issues, like over 40% of the world's illegal fishing is now taking place in West Africa. The region loses $9.4 billion each year to illegal fishing. China is the largest fisher in that area. So we also visited in the Gambia and met with many countries while we were there, and we kept hearing over and over again about how Chinese fishing vessels are exploiting loopholes, legal loopholes, bribing officials, both local and national, and taking advantage of really lax fisheries management and enforcement so that they can fish at will. And it's having a negative rippling effect in these coastal communities. You know, women who run the fish markets, for example, they no longer have fish to sell. And as a result, they can't send their kids to school. They can't provide medicine for their children. And the food insecurity is just growing and growing because this was the cheapest resource for these countries that are in poverty. And now those fish are going overseas, either whole or as fish meal for aquaculture. But we're starting to see civil unrest. These communities are getting fed up. There have been more and more protests, particularly in Senegal and the Gambia, where they are really overwhelmed with these exploitive fishing practices and corruption and environmental degradation. So, like Kathleen, I've kind of put together a bleak picture. However, I am optimistic. The good thing about the ocean is it's resilient. If left alone, if protected, the ocean and its ecosystems come back. And so I think there are lots of opportunities through managing resources sustainably, developing countries stepping up and literally working collaboratively to provide science, training, capacity building, and really working at multilateral cooperation. It's a must, and it requires political will. And I think as we start to see more protests and civil unrest, let's think about it. We've just seen a lot of coups in Africa recently. I think the leaders of these countries are a bit nervous. And so as unrest occurs, I think they're starting to pay attention. And I'll just leave you with one last thought on that. When we were there, we tried to meet with the Chinese officials running the fish meal plants and the government. They didn't want to meet with us, but the Gambian government met with us. And after we left, the Gambian government met with these officials to talk about a lot of the issues that were raised. And I see that as a positive sign. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Stephanie, if I could ask you. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and I don't know, is this my good?
You're okay. You might want to move the mic.
All right, here we go. I think, there's a very, obviously, a bleak picture to paint on the climate crisis as well. But I think, at least to start, I won't get into all of that. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the reality of the climate crisis, although I think we've all kind of been living it in recent years and certainly recent weeks and months. I'm also happy to get into a little bit more. I was at most recently the National Security Council, where we were really focused on climate change as a security threat. If you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy, climate is sort of peppered throughout it because of the many different ways that it affects the way we handle any number of other global threats. So I was happy to get into that a little bit, but I think, because climate is one of those issues that is just so inherently global, when you think about the problem, it's this sort of like blanket of greenhouse gases that is around our planet, and it doesn't matter where those gases are coming from. They all have the same impact, and so unless every country is sort of dealing with this challenge, the problem's going to get worse. So how do you deal with that? I thought I'd start with just a little top-line history of how the world has tried to deal with it, the global climate regime, some of the negotiations, challenges that we've faced. And then maybe explain a little bit about the Paris Agreement. I found that unless you were one of those of us in the room sort of trying to figure out exactly how to do it, most people aren't really aware of what it is. They know it exists, they know it's the climate agreement, they don't know actually how it works. And then a quick just discussion of where we are today and some of the challenges that still plague us, and there are many in terms of the international cooperation. So most global negotiations on environmental issues follow the sort of convention protocol format. So you start with a convention that kind of outlines the challenge and some ideas of things that need to be addressed by a global treaty of some sort. And then there's usually a negotiation that follows that goes into a protocol. How's the world going to actually take this on? For example, we have the Montreal Protocol that addresses the hole in the ozone layer. So the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the convention that was established in the early 90s that made a couple of things clear. It did not get into the specifics of the challenge or what the global goals should be in terms of numbers or anything like that, but it did make clear that identical demands should not be made of all countries. And it also called for both the widest possible level of cooperation among countries, but it introduced this concept, which has sort of plagued climate conversation still today, of common but differentiated responsibilities. So in other words, we all have responsibilities to do something, but is differentiation among those countries. In the Framework Convention, there is a list of countries. This was in 1992, Annex 1. You'll hear sometimes in climate circles, Annex 1 countries. This is the most developed countries in the world. Certainly that included the United States. And it sort of said, these are the countries that are the biggest hurdle right now. The countries that were not on there were just sort of the non-Annex 1 countries. This comes back is relevant because, as you can imagine, the world changes. And so the list of countries that made sense in 1992 doesn't necessarily make sense today in terms of action. So a few years after this convention, the negotiations started on the protocol, and we eventually got the Kyoto Protocol, which was reached in the late 90s. And this was sort of a top-down approach. It made some legally binding requirements of just those Annex 1 countries, and essentially the rest of the world was off the hook. There was nothing, not even voluntary contributions from those countries. And those legally binding requirements for countries like the United States made it so that ultimately, after you negotiate this convention, then it has to go back to each of the individual countries, right, to ratify it and have it join this protocol and then enter into force, and so it can actually be an active agreement. It was a non-starter for the United States. And I think, George Bush gets a lot of the flack for not letting the United States join that, but I think there's no chance a Democratic president could have sold that agreement to a bipartisan Congress either, because it did require legally binding issues from the United States, but it required nothing, for example, of China or any of the developing economies that, within just a few years, were easily surpassing those of the Annex 1 countries. So it didn't make sense as a way to actually attack the problem from a lot of folks' point of view. And it wasn't just the U.S. that didn't ratify it. Australia, Canada, a number of other countries did it. Nonetheless, it did enter into force. But without the buy-in of some of the biggest emitters in the world, it's a relatively weak agreement. So conversations started on another phase of the negotiations. What would a broader agreement be like? How can we get some more universal buy-in? And that's what led to the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. This wasn't an agreement that was negotiated over a weekend in Paris. It literally took decades and a lot of years of really intensive negotiations. And one of the first sort of things when the Obama administration came in and tried to really reprioritize this and take a look at how a global agreement could work, one of the first things they did was get at this concept of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea of bifurcating the world on an issue where it doesn't matter where the emissions are coming from was probably going to be a non-starter. So how do we make sure that there's enough support from both the developing economies that, to date hadn't yet been a big part of the problem, but will be in the future, and from the US's of the world and the Canadas and the Australias, et cetera. The Paris Agreement, there's sort of a few elements of how it works. This is not the top-down agreement, it's more of a bottom-up agreement, but it's sort of a hybrid. There is a set of global goals in the Paris Agreement that are basically the whole world is going to try and limit warming. At the time, it was to well below 2 degrees Celsius. This was that number, as you can imagine, they were thinking 1 degree, some were arguing for 3 or 4 degrees, and the language was well below 2 degrees in 2015. That's since been revised to 1.5 degrees, but that's sort of like the whole world is setting their sights on the same warming goal. And then the bottom-up approach is that this concept of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which is another term that's thrown around a lot. Each country, every single one of them, Annex 1 or otherwise, is required to take a look at its own national circumstances and basically, depending on the economic state of play, the political state of play, the technology access, et cetera, put forward, in writing, submit it to the UN, an economy-wide emissions target, what they think is reasonable. That they can hit. For the U.S., that was a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025. This is what we agreed to do in 2015. And each country sort of does the same. These are not legally binding targets because I think we, and for other countries as well, that would have still been a non-starter, and that's why the Paris Agreement wasn't ratified by the Congress, because it's all sort of voluntary on what we're committing to do. But the whole concept of its the teeth, for lack of a better word, is that it's based on sort of mutual kind of naming and shaming and mutual pressure that we're all trying to do the best. So how do you make sure that pressure is continuously applied? Well, every 5 years, starting in 2023, which in 2015 seemed like a long time away, but of course that's happening this year, the world would do a global stock take. So that's going to take place in the next few months. It'll be announced. And we're looking at exactly where we are on keeping warming down to the levels that the world agreed, and how each country is doing in comparison to the targets that it set. So once this global stock take comes out, and spoiler alert, I don't think it's going to be particularly encouraging news, then the countries are supposed to take the next 2 years, so starting in 2025 or no later than 2025, and set a revised target. And the idea is that countries would then ratchet up their targets every 5 years based on a number of things, including the pressure that they're feeling, but also the evolution of technology. Things get cheaper, easier, infrastructure is built, and ideally the world is able to tighten their targets over time. And again, doing so in a way that makes sense for their own individual economies and contexts. So no one is the world isn't telling certain countries what to do. The other dynamic here is the Green Climate Fund, which is not necessarily directly part of the Paris Agreement, but was negotiated in concert with that. And this was a way to get some of the poorest countries and the countries that are both responsible for the least amount of the carbon pollution, but also will face the worst impacts of climate change, to get them sort of bought into this idea that they're just as responsible for NDCs, et cetera, as like the United States. There's going to be some financial support. So the Green Climate Fund agreement was basically that the most developed countries would be contributing $100 billion a year annually to the Green Climate Fund, which would then go to help more developing countries to both adapt to climate change and also to reduce their own emissions and get to a green economy. That has also been a delay. This was supposed to be done starting in 2020. I think this year will be the first year there is $100 billion cumulatively going towards this challenge. And so it's definitely an ongoing debate. So what does this look like today? As I mentioned, we have the global stock take coming up. We're starting to think about 2040 targets. The EU, for example, has committed to announcing its own 2040 target by the end of the year. And now there's also a larger discussion, which is starting to take a lot of precedence in these global conversations about loss and damage. So we have the question of what are each of these countries trying to do to lower their emissions and set their own targets, but also the climate impacts are already being felt, sometimes really acutely and increasingly so. And we know that that's going to continue even as we mitigate emissions. The level of severity of these impacts is going to be, contingent on how much we can reduce our emissions, but they're going to be felt, and particularly among the poorest countries. So loss and damage is not about adaptation, it's not about resilience, it's really about sort of compensating or helping countries figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to exist when their economies, particularly, for example, some small countries in the Pacific that may cease to exist because of the projections of sea level rise, what are they owed? How can the world kind of support their ability to continue, as a nation when they have to move capitals or move countries or move, populations? How is this going to work? So there was the agreement last year that there would be another sort of loss and damage fund that would help countries deal with some of this. It's somehow now there's a balancing act between how do you continue the conversation on mitigation, as we say, on reducing emissions, going with this conversation on how do we help countries weather what is coming. And the other thing that sort of emerged, I think the Paris Agreement was reached in 2015. The conversations continue. There's also now a discussion of some of these sort of smaller regional and multilateral agreements that are looking at things like industrial pollution. For example, right now the US and the European Union are thinking about a global arrangement on steel and aluminum that would account for carbon intensity there. And so those two markets are regulating how carbon intensive some of these goods are going to be in their borders. Potentially you get to what is known as like a climate club, and countries can agree to similarly apply those restrictions, and then they get access to certain markets. These are really nascent conversations and probably overdue conversations, but thinking about how the interplay between climate and migration should look in international conversations, how the interplay between climate and trade. These are other conversations that are taking place sort of alongside the climate debate. So that's sort of just the state of play on how the world has tried to engage on this issue. I would say, just in closing, I think the Paris Agreement, it is not, it's far from a silver bullet. It is really not going to be the thing that gets us where we would need to be as a global community, because, you know, it's not legally binding, and it's not as ambitious as it maybe needs to be. However, it does enjoy the support of 196 countries. And all of those parties agreeing that this is a challenge and agreeing that they are going to continue meeting on it annually and discussing it and working towards their own progress sends a signal, and then it allows markets and other, other aspects of society to also prioritize this and focus it. And the flexibility of the agreement, I should say, too, is one of the things that's enabled it to stay. We all saw that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement. In actuality, the way that it was agreed, because it was, an executive agreement, once it entered into force, countries were locked in basically for 4 years, and then they could pull out. And it so happened that the agreement entered into force, I think the date was November 3rd, 2016, which meant that the Trump administration actually only pulled out of the agreement the day before the election in 2020. So the U.S. was actually only out of the Paris Agreement for about 40 days. And other countries didn't follow. So people, there were voluntary contributions. A lot of other countries did not see a reason to depart. So it's continued. It's endured as a framework for discussion, for continued ambition, and for each country to feel like it has its own sovereignty in figuring out how to solve the problem. So it's an interesting sort of model for how you deal with these issues, but that's sort of where we're at right now, and happy to talk further about it.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we've covered land, sea, and air, and next we are, if I don't screw up here too badly, we're going to discuss a new domain. We're going to talk about cyber, which in many ways also includes space at this point. So we're covering all domains. Jamel, I would be delighted to hear from you. Please go right ahead.
Well, Ron, thanks for having me, and great to be here with Sally and Stephanie. And in some ways, the magnitude of the challenges we face in the oceans and in the climate is so vast. It's hard to even compare it to the more limited, I think, challenges. Even though cyberspace is sort of the newest and evolving of these domains, most rapidly evolving these domains, I think the challenges are more manageable, as hard as that might be to imagine, because of the magnitude of the problem, and even the length of time we've spent on these problems, the magnitude still remains huge. And I know I enjoy having the conversation with you all, so we're going to jump into questions pretty soon. So I'm going to go fast. I'm just going to cover some high points on some of the fault lines as I see them in the cyber domain, and then we can have a more interesting conversation about where some of the parallels are and the challenges and the differences. So look, one is obviously the novelty of the domain. Cyberspace is relatively new and relatively new as a challenge as compared to the ones you've heard about thus far. But it's also that there are fundamental disagreements in the cyber domain that perhaps are less present. There have been historical disagreements over the oceans, historical disagreements over climate, but we've seen largely a consensus evolving, right? These are shared resources. There's an acknowledgement. Stephanie, you pointed out that 196 countries signed up to the Paris Agreement. The Trump administration out for a hot minute. But at the end of the day, there's largely a consensus on these are problems that need to be dealt with, and there's a consensus on how to deal with the problems. Everyone may not agree on the details. There may be economic and challenges with people actually being able to meet their commitments or the like. But fundamentally, there's a notion that we're all rowing in the same direction. Not so in the cyber domain. In the cyber domain, there's a fundamental disconnect between roughly two blocks of nations, right? What I would call sort of the traditional democratic countries, the Western nations, the United States, the UK, the EU, and the like. And there's a general consensus there that the goal should be to keep the internet free and open, keep the cyber domain open, even though we expect nation states to operate and act in that domain. That the general goal is one that tends towards open access to information, sharing of information, and the like. Now, there are disagreements at the margins, right? There's efforts to establish data sovereignty in Europe and the like, and an increasing trend in that direction. But by and large, there's general agreement on the principles that apply in the cyber domain, the idea of applying international law historically as it operated in the domain of warfare and the like, roughly speaking, to this new domain of competition and cooperation. On the other side, in the group of nations that I would include Russia and China as leading, there's a view of the domain as an opportunity, yes, but also as a threat internally, a challenge to be managed at home, an opportunity to be utilized at home to control and direct and guide their own populations. And so when the Russians come to the table at the UN and talk about the need for a cybercrime convention, right, or a cyber convention or the like, which they proposed twice, one as recently as earlier this year, their goal is not to address the international problem of cybercrime or the challenges at the borders and how we negotiate with one another, as the Budapest Convention does, and how we negotiate agreements of sharing information. Their view is, let us deal with our own cyber problems internally. Let us manage our own population. You go figure out what you're going to do. We're not going to mess with what you do at home. You don't mess with us at home. And the Chinese roughly are aligned in this domain. And so you've got two working groups at the UN, the GGE, right, the group of governmental experts. You've got the open-ended working group, both of which in theory are complementary, but in reality are sort of managed by the groups that control them and are moving those agendas forward. And as a result, there is not really a commonality of thought on what the problem is and how to deal with the problem in the UN, much less amongst these two blocks of nations. So unfortunately, I am skeptical of our ability to get to a global consensus on how to deal with the challenges that we see in the cyber domain. Challenges, by the way, that are magnifying daily, not just because of the last year of expansion in generative AI and the amazing revolution we've seen, but because of the continuing expansion of cyber threats, the use by nation states of cyber capabilities, the use by proxies of cyber capabilities. And I see I'm getting the hook. So I will end on this note, which is, while I am skeptical, the fact of the matter is that there is a tremendous opportunity in this domain for continued growth and innovation. This opportunity that we have with generative AI and the like is actually one that I am not as worried about as you may hear on the news with a lot of these sort of doom and gloom. I see it as an opportunity to raise all boats. I see it as an opportunity to allow people to do what they do better and something that actually levels the playing field and not differentiates the playing field. There are aspects of it that will differentiate. And so if we can get some amount of consensus, at least even among the Western nations, I think there are real unique opportunities to be had in this space. So with that, let's go fight about it.
Thank you very much, please. Thank you. There are two reasons for you to stand up. Number one is I have a bad back, and number two,
Got me to shut up.
is to have a chance to look and make sure that we see each of these individuals and you as well, so I can call the game here. Let me ask each one of you, privilege of the chair, and then we'll turn it over to those who have questions in the audience. Just going down the line, and actually let us start with Jamel first. There are always in these seminars the question of what keeps you up at night. For the most part, in a town filled with Ambien and other drugs, I don't think we need to worry about that. But let me ask the question, which is, what's the problem that worries you most in your field, and what would you do about trying to solve it? So, Jamal, please, first.
Yeah, look, I mean, what worries me most, and it's not really a commons issue so much as it's just an issue of what's taking place in the cyber domain today, which is to say there is not effective deterrence in the cyber domain. And as a result, you have a constant series of activities where adversaries on both sides of the equation are testing each other's boundaries and pushing further and further, and there is the potential for strategic or tactical miscalculation that leads to strategic surprise. And so that's what I worry about. I worry that today, and by the way, I don't think that deterrence is impossible in the cyber domain. I just don't think we practice it effectively. And as a result, we open ourselves up to the possibility that any one of our adversaries or we take one step too far, and that causes significant consternation, potentially resulting in actual conflict in the non-cyber domain, which could be a real problem. And I can say more about that if we go into it.
What would you do about it?
What would I do about it?
If you ruled the world, what would you do?
Well,
Or the cyber world?
right. I don't even want to rule the world. I'll take the U.S. alone, right? If I could just have Stephanie's job in the next administration, well, not the next administration where there's sanity, I would, and I had control of the cyber domain. I would want us to practice deterrence in the cyber domain, right? There's this old saw about, we always tell our kids, right? Look, if you get in a fight on the schoolyard or somebody's harassing you or whatever, don't get in a fight with those kids, right? Go tell the teacher. The parents will handle it behind closed doors, right? And that's actually the worst advice to give your kid, right? The better advice to give your kid is that kid that's bullying you, punch him right in the face in front of everybody and knock him out. Because if you do that, not only is that person going to stop bothering you, nobody else is going to bother you anymore. Yeah, it might cause some fights at the margins, but people really aren't going to mess with you. And in the international domain, the same is really true. Now, by the way, I'm not saying we should give this advice to our kids. And I don't give this advice to give to my kid, but I'm just saying, in the international domain, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and North Koreans are coming after us, the U.S. in particular, every day, and in a more and more aggressive way. We're seeing billions of dollars, trillions in total, walk out the back door, intellectual property, research and development dollars, right? And we're doing largely nothing effective about it. Not nothing, but nothing effective. If we were to take the fight to the adversary in a real way and make them start bearing the cost, and that cost can be economic, it can be material, it can be a variety of costs, but actually make them feel the pain of their actions, you'd see a lot less activity. But we're not willing to do that. And by the way, that's been true in Republican administrations, it's been true in Democratic administrations. We're just not willing to exact costs. And maybe it's because I'm wrong. It's not causing us that much pain. I don't think so, but maybe that's why.
Very good, thank you. Stephanie?
Well, I would actually say the thing that keeps me up these days is really like AI and all. So I'm really encouraged to hear that it doesn't keep you up so much, that it's not as scary as I think it could be.
It keeps you up, but I'm excited about it.
That's really encouraging. You'll help me sleep better. I think on the climate space, there are sort of two things just quickly. I mean, the first thing for me is just the politicization of the issue, I think is a real challenge. So it's not even the consensus on the threat itself. We're not really having even the active debates on the policy yet in the United States. It's really still, to a certain extent, a fight about the threat itself. And we're seeing actually more of that happen around the world. It used to be the United States was the only one really having that fight. Now there's some political forces, in Europe and elsewhere too, that are politicizing this, and that's a real problem. But more broadly, I think it's the fact that we're starting to feel the impacts of climate change. It really is causing some real fissures in the UN system and in sort of the global community, and I think that that's only going to become more pronounced. I think that's quite scary. That a large part of the world, this is going to be more and more existential for them, and they're not going to be able to get the support that they are seeking. I don't see, anytime soon the United States giving more than it has to date, or other countries giving anywhere near what is needed economically in these countries. And I think that's going to cause a real divide that extends well beyond the climate crisis in some ways. So that's scary to me too.
What happens?
In that
So the Kiribati disappears, right? And we keep seeing these challenges. Do those countries just fall away? I mean, do they become irrelevant? Or does it cause civil war? How does this play out?
All of the above, I think, are potential. And I think one of the things that, we talk about climate as a security threat, and there's a lot of reasons that that's true internally in countries and civil wars and the like, but it's also, right now there's a lot of peaceful protests around the world on climate change. Kids not going to school or people marching in the streets. But the more these become, affecting people's ways of lives, the more that farmers who have for generations made a living in countries where agriculture is 80% of the economy can no longer grow anything on their land, can no longer feed their families, the more, you see a rise in what could be quite violent, understandably so, and the finger is pointed. I mean, everyone knows which are the countries that have caused, the crisis that we're living in. And I think that's a real security concern that we should be paying close attention to as we think. And, there's just not a lot of foreign aid in general, doesn't have a lot of constituency in the United States. Foreign aid related to climate, even less. So there's not much that we are doing or can do necessarily in the next few years anyway that helps to mitigate that.
Why don't we move on to Sally, and then we can open up the floor. So Sally, you've got the last word here.
Okay, well, I'll just say regarding Kiribati, I mean, it's a perfect example. I mean, they're, right now, they are selling the last of their resources, their fishing resources, to China. I mean, and they see that as their hope. We did a report on adaptation and resilience there not too long ago. But, I'll say, what keeps me up at night? Well, obviously, the climate issues that connect to the marine resources, and this is a perfect example. Also, the plastic pollution. I mean, and, it is just everywhere, and I said, are we really having plastic? But I was told that it's recycled, or I don't know. But folks, let's just get off of plastics, okay? It's in the fish, it's in the birds, it's in everything we eat. It doesn't bode well. The other issue, obviously, is this loss of fisheries. On a positive note, is countries are coming together. There is technology. We have, we can surveil where illegal fishing is happening. Now we just have to get the political will to enforce. And as I said earlier, I think we're going to start to see countries that have been, corrupt or being paid off at the top are now going to start to sort of change their tune as these, protests arise. I was in East Africa not too long ago, and we heard stories literally from the head of the fisheries enforcement saying they'll bring in vessels, particularly Chinese, and then they'll get a call from up on high saying, look the other way. I think that's going to have to change, and I think it will change, and I think, China is transactional. If they can get it, they'll go for it. But if, the name and shame and the pressure starts to come on high, I think they'll sort of change their tune a bit. They have a lot of laws against illegal fishing globally. They just need to start enforcing them. Their own fisheries crashed. I think they have a lot of lessons they can, both in marine protected areas, spatial planning, other sort of management that they can impart in these countries where they are fishing and have operations. So I'm kind of hoping that's the direction that we're going in.
Let me just take one more shot from the chair. I spent 7 years on the board of advisors and directors for Apollo 13 astronaut Pete Conrad. And so I spent a lot of time in the space business. We're spaced out as my wife. I am not optimistic in that arena. It is a world in which it is a space and place, both in Moon and Mars at this point, that are wide open. I would suggest to you along the lines of cyber, the ability to control these areas is minimal. The militarization of these areas has gone on very rapidly. I was displeased by the initial reaction to Space Force. In fact, it's needed desperately. And if you see Russia and see China, you'll note their involvement. And you will also note, by the way, this is no longer, and if I'll use an old-fashioned word, a first world space. In fact, now we have competitors in terms of UAE and other countries around the world, India most recently, who have very sophisticated space programs. And low Earth orbit now is so crowded that we're actually worried about collision damage and a bad version of the movie Gravity happening. So anyway, for that space, let's open up more space, which is, please, if there are any questions, open up the floor. Let's grab one of my students first. Oh, I'm sorry. Please. No, Ellen first, please.
Are we on? Okay. So I just have a couple of quick comments. First, Sally, on the plastic cups. It's hilarious. The university banned them, and then there was an election and a new governor in the Commonwealth, and the plastic cups came back. So just an example of politicization of global commons issues, okay? Second, I was intrigued by Stephanie. I just wanted to make a connection. I did think the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change of 2021, made a point a little bit similar to yours, just to underline that is climate now a new metric to define geopolitical successes and failures? Will how individual countries step up to the plate on climate turn out to be one of the determinants of who are the winners and losers in the international system? So it's different than just saying climate stresses can exacerbate conflicts. It's actually saying climate is a new kind kind of determinant of geopolitics, which is really, quite interesting.
I just wanted to add that's. I'm glad you mentioned the NIE. It is about 80% of it was declassified to help people understand some of these connections. So it's all available on the DNI website, and it's a really helpful way to understand a little bit more about exactly that. So
Thanks. But I guess I wanted to pick up on something cross-cutting. Jamil, I was hoping you'd say a little bit more about the private sector. Are they underrepresented in negotiations over cyber? Should they be at the table? Or are they just ignoring that whole process because it's not in their interest? And then if I could let me just throw out one more question and then I'll sit down. Sally, your China-Africa example intrigues me of whether it's potentially a successful model, or is it almost a sign of a failure of setting international standards, and then at the end, sovereign states will make their own deals? And are you worried that the West Africans' own interest in the sustainability of their fishing stocks will fall victim to the great power coming in and sort of bullying them or coercing them to giving up their own natural resource? So it's about that sustainability question, and is a bilateral model consistent with or at odds with the concept of preserving the global commons? Thanks.
Sure. Quickly, Ellen, thanks for the question. I think the regional approach is gaining, and the multilateral approach to negotiating access agreements is starting to gain support. It's in the Pacific Islands, they have created that model, and it's been very successful for them. And I think a lot of the academics, NGOs, civil society is trying to educate their sovereign governments about that approach. And I think it is coming. I really do. It may not come tomorrow, but I think it is the future, because these fish stocks are just crashing. And when you look at the disparities of what one country gets in an access agreement from China to the next, they're like this. And I think that upside down approach is not going to work for many countries as they see their shared resources basically robbed.
On the question about the private sector, you're exactly right that I left that out, and not intentionally. The private sector obviously plays a significant role in the cyber domain here in the United States. Control over 98% of internet IP addresses is in the hands of the private sector, and that goes beyond not just traditional devices, but critical infrastructure as well. And so the private sector has a critically important role to play in these conversations. At the UN, they're less represented, but writ large across the globe, you're seeing actually an interesting trend where you're seeing certain private sector companies, Microsoft perhaps most prominently, kind of leading ahead and actually behaving like you might see a nation state behave, negotiating international agreements with other nation states and other companies. The Paris Call, in particular, as an example of that. And there's a Digital Geneva Convention that Brad Smith sort of has been quarterbacking, first as general counsel and now as president of Microsoft. Whether those are positive innovations and or whether those are going to be successful isn't open for debate. But it's an interesting dynamic to see take place with a major American corporation seeking to establish international norms sort of on its own with the cooperation of countries, not necessarily always including the United States itself. And I think it's an interesting dynamic playing out. So it's a great question.
All right, who has the next question, sir?
Hello, my name is Kevin. I'm a master's student at the Shar School. First, thank you to the panel for coming out today. With my question, I wanted to bring it into space, and the question may seem a little out there, but I do think it's a real problem we'll face in the future, which is most of the commons, namely the maritime domain and cyber, are characterized by being readily accessible with a large history of human activity inside of them, whereas the space domain is very remote, inaccessible, very distant from Earth. So my question was, in your view, do you think that the current regime of international law and cooperation will fail to extend into space on account of that remoteness and characterized as being more anarchic? Or do you think that current international law will successfully at least lay a foundation of cooperation extraterrestrially? Thank you.
There are some laws extant A lot of it came out of the 1960s, where some of the initial thoughts about the non-militarization of space, ambiguous at best. A lot of people signed on, of course, to that idea. The Lunar Treaty, which came up, has not necessarily been signed by an enormous amount of people, at least which China, and I believe us as well. I don't think we signed on to that. We've not talked about the rest of the solar system, Mars, at this point. It is distant. However, it is getting less distant. And by virtue of the thousands of launches that now take place, and the fact that low Earth orbit is filled with 20 or 30,000 items, gives you an idea of how well it is used. Will be a place of military action. Cyber, of course, is increasingly part of space. Frankly, if we did get in a war at this point, one of the first things that would happen is, given the satellite warfare capabilities of the United States, China, and Russia, we would be blinding ourselves, essentially, in the middle of this fight. We're on the verge now of a potential, mining operations on the moon. Certainly, NASA, who has been pushed aside in much of this, by the way. And again, this is back to the cyber question. Very much a case of private entities or other countries who have not been regulated, have not been sort of part of these agreements coming to the fore now. It's a long-winded way of saying, it will take time to develop because, let's face it, they don't have air up there. That makes things difficult. It's difficult to get up there, but as I said, less so, more crowded. And I think, again, back to the cyber example, when you have a Russia and a China who have a different regime, a different set of ideas about how they wish to use space, and they are equal to us in terms of our space power and project that power, they will do so. So I'm not optimistic about how we move forward in space, except to say it's going to be a race. And I don't know how well we are prepared. Both Russia and China are still state-dominated. We have decided to split that, with NASA focusing essentially on exploration and moon. But SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others are certainly having their problems moving forward, and that is a huge crutch for us. So not sure I answered that question directly, but we are in Washington, so I answered the question I wanted to.
Ron, can I jump in? I'm actually not sure that space and the oceans are so different, right? The first time we reached, I was just looking it up on my phone, so I was on my phone. The first time we reached the bottom of the Marianas Trench was 1960. First time we launched a satellite into space was 1958. First access to space by a private company, 2008, SpaceX, right? First, non-governmental launches, right? First access to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, James, the movie, the filmmaker,
Cameron.
right?
Right, James Cameron.
2012, right? James Cameron, right? So not that far apart in terms of time when we explored the sort of the regions that are furthest from us or closest to us in the space domain, right? So there's a lot of parallels, I think. The other thing to say in space is, it's really interesting that today now we can actually talk about the real threats we see in the space domain, because with the development of the Space Force, just in the last 2-3 years, we've seen the U.S. government declassify a tremendous amount that we've known for a better part of a decade about our adversaries' activities. We now know that the Russians are actively targeting our satellites in outer space, that they have the willingness and the capability to conduct offensive activities against our satellites in outer space, and that the Chinese have a capability as well. They demonstrated the capability just in the last year or two to grapple their own satellite, take it, and move it to a different orbit, right? That is not for the sake of, conducting space repair operations. Let's be clear.
This really does tie back in the cyber world, because, as you know, the United States military has declared itself to be net-centric, which means the vast majority of its operations now are taking place in and over cyberspace, which means that those connections are vulnerable, because much of that is, as they say, going up and coming down. And also, by the way, in the sea, because you guys keep laying cables all the time, imitating telegraph lines from the 1900s. Next question, please. Sir.
Hi, I'm Doyle Hodges. I'm a teacher at the Shar School. And my question is for all the panelists, but picking up on something that you raised, Jamil, was this sort of faith in self-help as an effective pillar of deterrence. And I guess I'm really curious because, the obstacles to taking action are not simply about the cost, but also about the precedents that are set in international action. And so I guess I'm curious to explore a little bit more that faith that self-help would be effective as a deterrent mechanism in the cyber domain, or whether the follow-on risks of everyone deciding, well, this is sufficient for me to take some sort of punitive action might be greater. And for the other panelists, whether there may be an expanded application of the concept of self-help to include potential uses of force. We've seen China certainly doing that in the context of IUU fishing to actually enforce unauthorized claims. But whether there is space for expanded use of coercion in order to protect interests in the commons, and if so, how you justify that? What's the basis of that claim, since it doesn't rest strictly on traditional sovereignty?
Who wants to take it first?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I'm happy to jump in. So look, in the cyber domain, I guess what I would say is two things. One, the reality is that the activity is already happening, right? If it were a scenario where we didn't have an active, ongoing, low-level war in the cyber domain, we might have a different story. The reality is that we and our adversaries are constantly in battle, right? It may be, again, not a pitched battle, right? But they're stealing our stuff, and not just intelligence collection. I'm talking about actual economic value walking out the back door. I'm talking about actual offensive operations that cause harm in physical space, right? Back in 2015, the North Koreans bricked computer systems in Culver City at what used to be Columbia Pictures, right? Now Sony Corporation, right? In the same year, 2015, Iran bricked computer systems in Las Vegas at Las Vegas Sands Corporation because they were concerned about comments that the CEO of that company had made publicly about Iran. And so we've seen already the kind of physicality and the kind of offensive activity that requires or would merit a response if it happened in the physical domain. And so the idea that self-help is going to cause a spiral to the end is actually why we haven't taken action. You're exactly right. It's a concern about the parade of horribles. The problem is we're already setting another norm, which is you can conduct activities that have effects in the physical domain. You can still billions and trillions of dollars in intellectual property and not pay a price. And so I don't disagree that self-help will cause norm setting in the opposite direction, but we have to realize that by not acting, we are creating a norm the other way as well. And by the way, I think the same is true in the oceans, right? If we don't respond to Chinese behavior, right, we're going to set the same norms. But I mean, Sally would know
Sally,
more
why
than I
don't
would.
you address that issue?
Well, and I mean, from a U.S. perspective, we are responding. There is a law that was added to DoD reauthorization law a couple years ago called the Maritime Safe Act. And out of that, you now have a working group of 21 different federal agencies all focusing on illegal fishing. And, I mean, everywhere from DoD and Coast Guard and state and NOAA, et cetera, and on and on. And so I think there is a recognition. And it's not just leveling the playing field for our own fishermen, which we talk a lot about, but it's also the multiple threats that are caused by, the human rights abuses on board vessels, the taking advantage of poorer countries, the loss of resources, and then coupled with that, gun running, drug smuggling, human trafficking. All of this is linked into these issues that we as a country are so far removed from and, do not support. And so we have taken that approach, us, the European Union. There have been some real leaders in this. And so I think really trying to address this multi-pronged approach as a government, we're doing very well there. And it's not just to help our own economy, although that's part, that does have benefits.
Yeah, I think we're still some time away from any sort of proactive, coercive methods used on emissions reductions or anything like that. But one thing we haven't touched on is geoengineering, which is an area that is sort of linked to some other forms of combat. I've played war games, tabletop exercises before. Where we look at geoengineering, and this is the process of injecting particles into the atmosphere that help reflect the sun back and can temporarily cool the planet. We don't know enough about it yet, but what we do know is that it's relatively cheap. You can do this for like $1 billion. So you can see, private actors doing it, and particularly like desperate countries that are convinced that the richer countries are not, doing enough. once you start to see, we don't know how it all interacts. We don't know what the thresholds are. We don't know how the climate will be, long-term affected by all of this. And so if you start to see the deployment of geoengineering in an unregulated way, in tabletop exercises, it's not long before it gets to conventional warfare. And that's a scary concept when the research is so thin, and it's actually also a political hot button issue whether or not to explore research and to do some of that. So that is one area where I think we are going to have some norms and think about how we prevent the unregulated use of these technologies, which may be necessary.
Okay, who else we got here? Pam? Just remember, I'm grading you for the class on this.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm a graduate student here. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for your very insightful comments. I can't believe we're in an economy where $1 billion is just not a lot of money. That's crazy. But this question's really about the ocean. So the number you gave, ma'am, was astronomical in terms of how much is taken out of that area every year in the sea there. How long do you think that can be sustained without drought happening in not only West Africa, but it feeds more than just that? What do you think the long-term implications is in terms of feeding that region? But I know you had a more positive, I guess, looking forward, more positive thinking than I have. What are your thoughts on that? You were good about it.
Well, it's hard to be doing public policy for so long and not still be positive, or we'd all be crazy, or maybe we are all crazy. I don't know. But yeah, no, it's a really good point, and that's why it's so important that we get science and monitoring and training and capacity building into these places in the world where resources are literally being robbed. But we're also, as I said, seeing already certain protests and civil unrest, and I think that helps put a spotlight on things. I also have to say, from the comment about space and the ocean, I mean, the ocean is far less, there's been a lot less focus on an understanding of what's going on in the ocean than there is in space as far as exploration. So I think we just need to remember that the ocean is 70% of our planet, and we do need to put a lot more focus on understanding it and its resources, and then how that affects communities on the coast. I mean, let's all be real. When it all comes down to it, it is the people and the communities that are, affected and are going to make the difference. So I do believe, though, there are opportunities for some of the those that are robbing the resources. I think, surveillance, enforcement, and prosecution needs to move forward, and it needs to be move forward in a big way. I think, hammering China over the head doesn't work, but engaging them into the science and the capacity building and tech transfer and developing marine protected areas, sort of the issues around the margins, will bring that into the fold in a way. I mean, we used to talk about environmental diplomacy as the easy diplomacy that could bring people to the, governments, sovereign governments, to the table where they may not talk. And I still am a believer in that. So the people on the ground will see it. There will be those reactions. And then I think we can use these other sort of diplomatic ways of, helping with science, technology, management, and whatnot.
Sally, let me just ask a quick question on that. We've chosen to have not an involvement with the law of the sea. That has been a debate for some time. Does that hinder, well, first of all, if you could explain that, but does that hinder U.S. policy as you're talking about the oceans?
All right, well, now we're going to get at our age. So way back when, there was a senator by the name of Jesse Helms from North Carolina.
Oh, well.
Who opposed I don't know how many years ago was that, but who opposed the U.S. joining the law of the sea. But what the State Department over the many years has done is we are a party and we practice everything in the law of the sea. And governments all around the world know that. So we are at all the negotiations, we are at the discussions, we are very involved with the different protocols and pieces and implementation. Yet, you will hear from China and Russia often, the United States, not part of the law of the sea. You know, they talk the big game, but they're not part of the law of the sea. But I think for those, other than just that political aspect of it, I think countries know we are all in, and we do support all the pieces of it.
Next question, please. Sir.
Hi, I'm Abiel. I'm a master's student, and seeing how vital the industries or the fisheries industry is to food security and the general climate space, I was wondering if there are areas of cooperation with the space industry, for example, innovation in increasing the amount of medium Earth orbit satellites, possibly, and seeing.
It's a great question. Absolutely. There are a lot in the research. Well, in research and operations, I mean, there's Global Fishing Watch, which is a technology that literally, and there's some others similar to it, satellites that track illegal fishing vessels all around the world. You know, there was a big project not too long ago in North Korean waters, and what we found was there were all these Chinese vessels fishing illegally in North Korea, and it was, China claimed they were not, but the satellite showed that in fact they were. So there are technologies that are being very informative on the surveillance. Our DoD also knows. But there's also a lot of technologies from satellites that help us understand, you know, whether it's earth color and know where fisheries are. I mean, obviously, if we can see and understand where fisheries are in the habitat, we're going to know where the fishers are going to go to collect them. If, you know, the ocean's big, so we can't be in every place at once, so we have to target it. And space technology and satellites have been very helpful.
Stephanie, I assume that's also true in climate.
Yeah, it's true. It's an interesting, the increase in technology. Now we're getting better at also understanding exactly where emissions are coming from. So also in terms of enforcing the ability for countries to, or that they're doing what they say they're doing, there's new technologies that are emerging to see where exactly, not just in what country, but like literally down to a facility where there's massive amounts of, you know, methane, which is like a short-lived climate pollutant that's really, really potent, way more than carbon dioxide. We're seeing countries that are saying, or regions or cities that are saying, or companies that are saying, we've cut down on all of our emissions. That's getting increasingly easier to tell because of space technology, whether that's true, whether it's not true, and if there is a world in which there are more aggressive measures or laws or international agreements, we'll actually be able to enforce them in a way that, you know, we couldn't have years ago.
Next question. Since you're no longer in a class, I can't grade you, but go ahead.
That's okay. This question is more directed at Stephanie. So looking at kind of when you touched on the security risk of wealthier countries versus those that are in the global south looking at climate change, kind of the danger that green hydrogen rules are written by the private and powerful investors, how that is kind of yet another green commodity trap for countries in the global south. The SHAR School recently did a trip to South Africa and looking at the just energy transition and whether or not that's a viable model for financing in the global south.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really huge part of the debate, and it's something that when I was in the government we also struggled with, is how do you make sure that countries aren't sort of trapped into technologies that we know are going to be harmful for the whole planet, but also you can't really go to some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and tell them they can't exploit the resources that they have, especially when you're the United States, and we became the United States and the economy we are today because we did just that. And by the way, we're still doing just that. I think the war in Ukraine made that even harder, and the energy crisis in Europe and all of the focus on getting more gas to Europe, and some of the same countries that we had been having conversations with about, you know, assistance and ways to get new technologies and go to green hydrogen or generally just to solar and wind. Now the same countries are going to them and asking them to build new infrastructure for their oil and gas resources to get that to Europe. And those are infrastructure that's going to be existing for the next, 20, 30, 40 years. So it's really made this more of a challenge. I think green hydrogen in particular there's a lot of hope around it, but it's not proven yet. It's not usable yet. And so in a lot of ways, it's used as a way to build new gas infrastructure and just say it's hydrogen ready. So when the technology gets there, we can just switch the pipes. It's not really going to be that easy. So it is a huge challenge. We have energy engagement guidance in the U.S. now that's trying to move all of our federal dollars away from new fossil fuel infrastructure. But of course, we have to include exemptions, and those exemptions have to include energy access, severe energy access needs, and a lack of viable alternatives. So finding that balance that enables countries to expand the access to power and electricity and energy in whatever way they can, if they can't do it with renewables or in a clean way. We have to allow for that in order to, again, build some of the global sense of community and environment that we're all in this together. And it's a really huge challenge, and definitely something that comes up when the president talks to leaders in these places. Energy issues are often at the top of the agenda in ways that it was not the case in the Obama administration. Sally and I served the State Department then in a very new way. When I was in the White House, it was constant. Every time the president was talking, whether it was in Europe or Africa or in Asia, anywhere, these are the issues that leaders now are on their minds as we're trying to balance between the energy issues, the development issues, and the need for aggressive climate action. It's tough.
Next question. Sir.
Hi, good morning. My name is James. I'm a PhD student here at the Schar School. I wanted to kind of just pull a little bit on a thread of part of the story that both Sally and Stephanie were describing in terms of this tension of kind of big nation actors or leadership on the global commons. And Sally, you spoke about kind of the temptation of West African countries to kind of, go with these bilateral or fishing agreements that China is doing. And then Stephanie, you talked about, well, the U.S. was, out of the Paris Agreement for 40 days, but not a whole lot of other countries followed. So, if we know that these resource challenges, these, kind of solutions for common pool resource dilemmas are based on trust and agreed upon sanctioning mechanisms and all the things that the literature tells us, what happens when countries either break that trust, like pulling out of an agreement, or don't submit themselves to common sanctioning mechanisms? And really, I guess my question is, what are the implications for kind of leadership of the global systems? I'm not going to call it a global order necessarily, but the systems and which voices other countries are listening to in that tension of kind of leadership.
It's an easy one.
Yeah. I think the word is transparency and knowledge. The U.S. consumer, just as an example, has no idea that like 80% of the seafood we eat in the United States is imported. Now, some of it is caught here, sent to China for processing, and then re-imported. But that said, I think being more transparent about the food we eat so that the markets can respond, the people, the consumers, I think is one way. We also, in the fishing industry, the big five are, no surprise, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and then Spain or other parts or Russia. They sort of go back and forth. And so I think it's ensuring that those countries that are the big fishers, that are more in line with our norms, that they start to move forward and showcase that they can be leaders, they can be more transparent. There is more accountability and transparency about who owns these companies, who owns these vessels, where does the seafood come from, all that sort of thing. I think being, more open governance. China, believe it or not, has a relatively new open governance law. I think it's the pressure that the other countries have to put on them to say, you've got these laws, you now need to use them overseas.
Next question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, no,
Please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that the credibility argument, it's real. I think that the U.S. in general, like depending on who's in the Oval Office, has a more widely different foreign policy than we used to see. And I think that does affect the way the rest of the world negotiates with us. But there are things we can do. For example, I think the IRA, for the rest of the world, that's a law now, right? It's for at least the next 10 years, it's tax law. It's not something like the EPA regulation or an executive agreement. That will change depending on who's in the Oval, and I do think that sends certain signals that is useful. But I also think there's a important space for negotiation and diplomacy and for a global regime, and I think part of that is the attention and the pressure that's mounted collectively. But I also, cooperation on climate, it's not necessary, for example, that the US and China both collectively cooperate to reduce their emissions. It is necessary that both reduce their emissions. China's 30% and growing of the global emission system. About 20 countries are responsible for about 80% of global emissions. It's necessary that all of those countries take steps individually to reduce their emissions. How they do it is not necessary for it to be part of an agreement or to do it holding hands. So I think we also have to think about, that's why trade and some other measures come into place. Like, what are the other tools in the toolbox to apply pressure that other countries are thinking about with us and that we can think about with other countries too, that just change internal calculus and move individual economies. If we can solve those 20 countries, we'll be a large way of the way there towards a solution on the climate crisis.
John, well, we seem to be headed in, speaking of this kind of thing in the internet, in terms of an old-fashioned political term, the balkanization of the internet, that in fact we have a block of countries now that have a very different approach to a Western Europe or the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about that? Can we arrive, do you think, at any kind of consensus, or is this just a world that we're going to have to live in, a world, a domain of conflict, no matter what?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but I am skeptical of our ability to come to a consensus in that domain, and it's in part because the balkanization you described, and there's these really two sort of polar opposite views of how the system ought to develop. And you know, I mean, look, right now we're talking about the U.S. potentially providing a mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel. So, you know, who knows, right? I mean, you know, the circumstances that brought that opportunity to bear are so unique, right? Netanyahu's challenges in Israel, the Saudis' relationship with the U.S. and our need for oil, but also our need to make a deal and pivot to Asia, right? So, you know, look, it could happen, right? I never thought this deal was on the table, but apparently it's on the table. So maybe. I did want to make a comment, though, an interesting point that you raised about the sort of vacillation in the U.S., you know, from president to president when it comes to foreign policy. I think you're exactly right, and it's been 4 presidents in a row, starting with President Bush, the administration I served in, and then when you all were in the Obama administration, I was at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee while you guys were at State, right? Part of the reason why I think you see that vacillation is that there's been a breakdown in the ability of the U.S. inside the U.S. to build consensus between the legislative branch and the executive branch of these issues. I tend to be a believer in executive power in this space, and I'm not somebody who's like, oh, the Senate's got to play a big role. But truth be told, the reason why Paris and the Iran nuclear deal had so many challenges, right, is because those didn't go through the regular order process in the Senate but get buy-in from the political branches, right? At the same time, the reason why it didn't get buy-in is because Secretary came to us on UNCLOS, on Law of the Sea, and came to us on the Convention on Rights on Persons with Disabilities, and we said, no, thank you very much. We're not going to do that, right? And so it's both sides' fault. I don't want to put the blame on either side. And by the way, you
voted on the Iran deal.
I don't. We did vote, and we made that vote happen, right? But the vote. What did the vote show? The vote showed there was not political support on either side of the aisle, right, in significant margins for that deal. It's what allowed Trump to walk away from the deal. The fact that we'd forced a vote on it, right? It's and so it's a real challenge. I mean, I think, and so one way to think about this is how do we rebuild that? And I think in climate, it's most pronounced. You said it sort of. I think probably too generously, right? The fundamental disagreements we have inside this country, which are exposed to the world because we can't help ourselves but tell everybody about these disagreements, are really what gives other nations top cover to not take it seriously. And what causes, the rise of Orban and these movements in Europe are not our fault, but the fact that we coddle some of the same theories here at home is what allows them to expand and gain traction abroad.
Sally?
I just want to make one comment about, Senate and the Congress and the executive branches. We hear everyone's upset, China and this country, Russia, gaining all this power and all this stuff, and providing all these, financial resources to developing countries so they feel beholden as they build out their infrastructure. Well, where is the United States on a number of these? We provide aid, but it's not the kind of aid, and if you're a poor country, and believe me, all you have to do is go visit some of these countries and you'll be like, I don't blame them. Not really, but you could. But our Congress, does not appropriate the funds necessary for the U.S. to do more. Yet, on the other hand, they're happy to grab a microphone and talk about how we're losing the race with these, some of these countries that don't have our democratic norms. And so I think that is such a disconnect that needs to be addressed. And, I think the infrastructure bill is a positive for us because for those who have said we aren't taking care of our own infrastructure, how are we going to take care of infrastructure abroad? I think now we can say we're taking care of our own infrastructure in certain ways, so we should also be trying to use that lever abroad to get countries to be more wanting to work with us.
Let me go back to cyberspace for a moment, because you have in your domain one of the more interesting issues for the United States. Michael Hayden, whose center I couldn't recommend. If you see events, please go. It's a wonderful place, and if anybody knows about the intelligence community, Mike Hayden sure does from top to bottom. Mike Hayden has referred to cyberspace as basically pipes and water, that you have hardware, software. My poor students have had this inflicted on them, so forgive me one more time. But one of the real debates has been over the water, the information coming through. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. We live in an age where obviously disinformation has come to the fore in many different issues. The discussion has been, there have been efforts to quote unquote regulate this. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Again, if you're in the government at this point, what do you do about this? The whole system, and of course an AI may well increase this. What do you do to sort of secure agreement about this, or can you? Go ahead, please.
Well, I hate to be the skeptic here, but I don't think you can secure agreement about it, because it's not like information operations are something new to our environment or that the cyber domain is created. We and our adversaries have engaged in information operations since the beginning of time, right? It is true that the scale and scope and the speed at with which you can engage these operations, the ability of smaller actors to play a role and an outsized role is growing. You'll see it in the next election. There's no question in my mind that deepfakes will play a critical role in the days and weeks and months and literally hours leading up to the 2024 presidential election, and may play a decisive role in the election, and not necessarily in a good way. Whatever view of good you have in that election. Not that there's necessarily going to be there's not a lot of good either way this thing plays out. There's worse for sure, but it's not a great scenario. I mean, I think everyone would say anybody would want better and more younger and more vivacious candidates, even folks that serve the administration. I'm not going to put you on that spot, but I mean, come on, right? I mean, if Donald Trump and Joe Biden are the best we have to offer as a nation, maybe we ought to just go home. But look, I think that information operations are here. They're here to stay. I don't see an agreement on necking those down. At the same time, I do think you're going to see responses to the fact that we will see these manipulations taking place and happening. We've already seen a reaction and response to what the Russians did in the 2020 and 2016 elections. There's been a lot of debate about how effective that was and whether it involves private companies engaging in manipulation. But this goes back to our own domestic politics, right? And the use of, look, anybody who doubts that the Russians tried to manipulate the 2016 elections is making it up. That is a fact. That is an undisputed fact, right? Now, you can debate it for political reasons, but the reality is that happened. And they tried to do it again, and the Chinese got involved in 2020. It's going to be worse in 24. And by the way, we've done it for decades, right? So the idea that somehow our hands are clean in space is not accurate. Now, the question is what we do about it and how we respond. And if we remain divided as a nation, and if we remain divided as a West and the democratic countries, we will not succeed. And our adversaries, who exploit these operations more effectively than we can because they take advantage of our free societies, and they're more effective at it because we are in a free society with open flow of information, we are going to lose. And our societies will become less free as a result. And that is not where we want to end up.
On that happy note, looking at the clock at 10:43 or 11:43 and standing looking at the food over there, I'd like to thank Sally and Stephanie and Jamal for coming today. Thank you for coming as well. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I believe, unless Ellen has something to say, there's food to be had. So thank you all very much.